Next, Civil War Sunday continues with historian Gary Gallagher. He discusses the memoirs of Confederate General Edward Porter Alexander, who fought in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Mr. Gallagher spoke at Greystone's American History Store in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as part of Greystone's History Books 2000 weekend.
Good evening. We're going to get started with our next speaker. Once again, I am Craig Hafner, president of Greystone Communications, and we welcome you to History Books 2000, put on by the American History Store here in Gettysburg. Next up is Gary Gallagher. He is perhaps the most prolific author of books on Gettysburg and the Civil War, and a frequent participant in many Greystone projects, including Civil War Journal, as seen on A&E and the History Channel, and our newest series, The Unknown Civil War, with 25 hours completed, and episode 26 coming, and we'll hear more about that tonight when William Frasnito's here. Dr. Gallagher is the John L. Now Professor of History of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He received his doctorate at the University of Texas in Austin in 1982. In his illustrious career, he has received the Fletcher Pratt Award and the Douglas South Freeman Award, among many, many others. Currently, he is working on the biography of Confederate General Jubal Early and a study of the ways in which Early and Douglas South Freeman influenced modern perceptions about the Confederacy. Today, Dr. Gallagher's speech will discuss his most recent book, Fighting for the Confederacy, the story of the Confederate artillery commander E.P. Alexander, who indeed was present here at Gettysburg. Also present here at Gettysburg, Dr. Gary Gallagher. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Craig. I'll make one small correction to what Craig said, and that is that this isn't my most recent book. This is actually a fairly distant book in my past, but one that I enjoyed working on a great deal, maybe enjoyed working on more than any other book that I've had anything to do with. Eileen Ann and I worked on it for about 3.5 years and really hated to finish our work on Porter Alexander because he was such an interesting fellow and because what he wrote tells us so much about the war here in Virginia. Alexander, who was never Edward to anyone, he was Porter or Alec to his closest friends, is a name familiar to students of R.E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was a remarkable character. I'll just give you the bare outline of his career before moving on to talking about his memoir. He was born into a prominent Georgia family in 1835, graduated from West Point third in the class of 1857 and was appointed a second lieutenant in the engineers. He was considered very promising from the beginning. He was put on the faculty at West Point, where he taught from 1857 to 59, taught military engineering and other topics. He was one of 2 officers selected in 1859 to test the system of visual signals developed and offered to the Army by Surgeon Albert J. Meyer, the famous wigwag system that most of us are familiar with. In 1860, Meyer and Alexander recommended that the Army adopt this system, and they went up to Congress to testify on the system. They testified before Senator Jefferson Davis's Committee on Military Affairs and called for the adoption of the system. Davis remembered, he was impressed by Alexander from these hearings that he held, and he remembered the young officer when he, Davis, occupied the presidency of the Confederacy and was looking for young soldiers in early 1861. Alexander was on duty in the Washington Territory when war clouds gathered in late 1860. In early 1861, and he decided very early on that he would do whatever his native state did. If Georgia stayed in the Union, he'd stay in the Union. If Georgia left, he would leave. Georgia left, of course, and Alexander headed back east. He arrived in Richmond June 1st, 1861, and he was commissioned a captain of engineers. His first duty was to oversee the production of signal apparatus in Richmond, and shortly thereafter was sent to Manassas for duty as a signal officer under General P.G.T. Beauregard. He simultaneously served as chief signal officer for that Confederate Army gathering near Manassas Junction, and as chief of ordnance. Most of his time was actually spent in the area of ordnance. That was a bigger job. He got along very well with Beauregard. He then got along very well with Joseph E. Johnston, on to whose staff he went when Beauregard headed west after First Manassas. He wore both those hats under Joe Johnston, the signal officer hat and the chief of ordnance hat, and he continued to do that after Johnston was wounded at Seven Pines on May 31st, 1862, and R.E. Lee took command of the army that he would christen the Army of Northern Virginia. Through the 7 days, Second Manassas or Bull Run, through the 1862 Maryland campaign, Alexander was a member of Lee's staff, and he had ample opportunity to observe Lee and also to be observed by Lee in the course of those campaigns, and Lee formed a very high opinion of this young Georgian. Alexander was always interested in artillery, and even when he was an ordnance officer, he thought about artillery. He wrote a paper in 1861 that urged that the Confederate Army organize its guns into battalions of artillery. He thought that would be a more efficient way to apply the strength of the long arm on the battlefield. It was a brilliant paper that caught the attention of Brigadier General William Nelson Pendleton, who was chief of artillery in Lee's army. He was a good judge of men, I think, Pendleton. He was not a good artillerist. He was not really an officer that the younger artillerists admired at all. They called him Granny Pendleton and lots of other things worse than that behind his back. But he was impressed with Alexander, and when Stephen D. Lee, who had commanded Confederate guns at Antietam, right near the Dunker Church, when he was made a brigadier general and transferred to the West, Porter Alexander was given command of the guns that Stephen D. Lee had been in charge of. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he was now in command of guns. In February 1863, Lee and Pendleton reorganized the artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia into 12 battalions, 6 for each corps, commanded by a corps chief of artillery. 2 battalions in each corps were designated as a corps reserve. Alexander was promoted to colonel and was given perhaps the best of James Longstreet's artillery battalions, one of the 2 in the 1st Corps Reserve. So here he is in early 1863. After his various duties and successes in the Signal Corps and in Ordnance, he'd found an important position in the arm of the service that most interested him and really where his best talents lay, I think. He absolutely loved working with the artillery. He was interested in the technical aspects of it, the ranges and charges of ordnance. That appealed to his analytical mind. He had an absolutely first-rate mind. 28-year-old Georgian also relished the wide responsibilities. He was very ambitious, extremely ambitious, in a hurry to get ahead, and he knew that as the commander of a battalion of artillery, he would have about as much responsibility in terms of area on a battlefield as a major general commanding a division of infantry, and that appealed to him. He wouldn't be reporting to very many people, to the corps chief of artillery and to the head of the corps, and that appealed to him as well. He immediately showed his brilliance as an artillerist. In the very next campaign of the Army in Northern Virginia at Fredericksburg, he directed the Confederate artillery on Longstreet's end of the line, that is the left side of the Confederate line that included the high ground at Marie's Heights, against which the major assaults that Burnside's troops mounted failed when they were pushed forward on the afternoon of December 13th. At Chancellorsville, he recognized the importance of Hazel Grove on May 2nd, the night of May 2nd, and hurried several dozen guns to that key high ground on the morning of May 3rd. It was Alexander's guns on the morning of May 3rd that allowed R.E. Lee to unite the wings of his army and to drive Joseph Hooker away from Chancellorsville. On both these battlefields, both at Fredericksburg with the 1st Corps Artillery and at Chancellorsville with Stonewall Jackson's artillery, he in effect acted as a corps chief of artillery, although he did not officially hold that position. In the 1st Corps, John B. Walton was Longstreet's Corps of artillery chief, He was much older than Alexander. He was with the famous Washington Artillery of New Orleans, and Longstreet was not willing to push Walton out of the way to make way for a clearly more talented gunner in Porter Alexander. But what he did do, time and again, was give Alexander effective control of the guns on a battlefield, whether Walton was there or not. It would happen again here at Gettysburg, and as most of you know, Alexander oversaw the bombardment of the Union line that preceded the Pickett-Pettigrew assault on July 3, 1863. After Gettysburg, Alexander went to Georgia and Tennessee with James Longstreet and the 2 divisions that he took with him. He was the acting chief of artillery in the 1st Corps at that point. Walton was on detached duty. Alexander had the official position as well as the effective position. He returned to Virginia in the spring of 1864. When Longstreet came back, shortly after he got back to Virginia, Joseph Johnston, who'd always been impressed with him, requested that he be sent west to be chief of artillery for the entire Army of Tennessee with the rank of brigadier general. When R.E. Lee heard that he'd been asked for by Joe Johnston, Lee refused to let him go, saw that Alexander was promoted brigadier general anyway, and made the official chief of artillery in the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. And he served in that capacity until the end of the war. He was present at Appomattox, where he drew the last battle line of the Army of Northern Virginia, and was present in all of the last key scenes of Lee and his army. He was by almost universal agreement the best artillerist in the Confederacy, and really, I think, one of the 2 best in the war. I think Henry Hunt and Porter Alexander were the best. I think Joseph Johnston understood that. I think R.E. Lee understood it. Jennings C. Wise, who wrote The Long Arm of Lee, which remains, after 85 years, the standard work on the artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia, clearly considers Porter Alexander the most talented gunner that fought with Lee's army. Very successful man who understood artillery in and out. He was open to innovations of every kind with the artillery, organizational and in terms of new kinds of ordnance. He was very good at organization. He commanded the respect of his men. Very effective leader on the battlefield, a strong personality, tremendous self-confidence. He is one of these people who is extremely talented and smart, much smarter than most people, more talented than most people, and he simply shone in almost every situation in which he found himself. Now, he could also be, I think, off-putting to some people who weren't as smart as he was and who didn't grasp things as quickly and who weren't able to function as well. He was young and he was cocky and he was ambitious, and I think that put some people off, but it didn't put off anybody who commanded an army in which Alexander fought. That group of men, from Beauregard to Johnston to R.E. Lee, not only trusted him and gave him a lot to do, but absolutely gave him a range of things to do, not just fight with the guns, but serve in capacities that would fall normally under the bailiwick of others. So Alexander, I think, stands out as a unique individual in the Army of Northern Virginia in many ways. He would become even more so in the post-war years, as I'll get to in just a minute. After the war, he had a brief period of hard time, but he wasn't someone who dwelled on the past. He didn't wallow in Confederate defeat. He didn't immerse himself in the work of the lost cause warriors, as so many former Confederates did. He accepted Confederate defeat, much as Lee did. He figured they'd done the best they could, they'd lost, and now it was time to do something else. He faced the future with the notion that a new South would be rising, and he meant to be part of that. He taught as a university professor for a while, but he had great success later on as an executive with railroads and as a man involved in other manufacturing and commercial ventures in the South. His most enduring post-war achievement, however, was publication in 1907 by Charles Scribner's sons of a book titled Military Memoirs of a Confederate. In preparing it, Alexander corresponded with former comrades in the Army of Northern Virginia. He used the recently published official records and other sources, and he wrote his account with an even-handed detachment that is not only unusual among Civil War memoirs, but singular. There is not another memoir by a Northern or Southern officer of substantial rank that matches Alexander's book in terms of its detachment and analytical rigor. He wrote in his preface that it was well that the Confederacy had failed, and he even found an occasion or two to criticize R.E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson in that book. That was very unusual behavior for former Confederates, and it was behavior that elicited some pretty harsh comments from former Confederates across the South. Military Memoirs was criticized in a number of Southern newspapers and in private correspondence among former Confederates. They didn't think Alexander should have been quite so frank in his appraisals of Lee and of Jackson. It's been a remarkably influential book. T. Harry Williams, whom most or all of you will know, is one of the more famous historians of the Civil War of the 20th century. He wrote Lincoln and His Generals and many other works. T. Harry Williams wrote, quote, "Probably no book by a participant in the war has done so much to shape the historical image of that conflict." Douglas Southall Freeman remarked that Military Memoirs was, quote, "the most valuable single commentary on the operations of the Army of Northern Virginia." Freeman admitted that he relied on Edward Porter Alexander's book more than on any other single author in his work on Lee and his lieutenants. I think it's a testament to the quality and influence of the book that it's never gone out of print. It's been in print since 1907, which is something that I think most authors been in print long after his death. So he and his family didn't make money for that whole time, but the book's been available for that whole time, and the number of books that fall into that category is very small, very small. But the title of the book, Military Memoirs of a Confederate, is a misnomer, for it isn't really a memoir of Porter Alexander's service so much as it is a history, a scholarly history really, of Lee and his army. Alexander appears in its pages, and he's even at center stage in some parts of the book, but he usually is not. Usually other commanders, other issues are at center stage. Across the decades, in fact, many students of the war, historians, and those interested in the war have wished that Alexander really had written more about himself. After all, he was everywhere, literally, from First Manassas to Appomattox. He was on every major battlefield of the Army in Northern Virginia and was off in North Georgia and East Tennessee besides. Got to Chickamauga just a little bit too late, but he was at Chattanooga, and then he took place in that spectacularly mismanaged East Tennessee campaign that Longstreet presided over in the winter of 1863-64. So he was everywhere. And not only was he everywhere, he was in close proximity to the full range of prominent officers in the Army in Northern Virginia: Beauregard and Johnston and Lee and Longstreet and Jackson and Jeb Stuart. All the major figures were very close to Porter Alexander at one time or another. Historians have said that an account of Alexander's personal experiences would be invaluable. In his introduction to a 1962 reprint of Military Memoirs, in fact, T. Harry Williams observed that Alexander, quote, "was modest in referring to himself. One could wish that he had written 2 books, a general history and a personal narrative." Well, in fact, Alexander did write 2 books. The published Military Memoirs, which came out in 1907 on Lee's Army, and a 1,200-page manuscript titled Fighting for the Confederacy, that includes a wealth of material on Alexander's own activities during the war, as well as a critique of Confederate operations in the Eastern Theater, as well as with Longstreet out in Georgia and Tennessee. He wrote Fighting for the Confederacy before he wrote Military Memoirs. In fact, he used Fighting for the Confederacy as the basis for the revised work that would become Military Memoirs. He was sent by President Grover Cleveland off to Nicaragua in 1897 to help adjudicate a boundary dispute between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. He was lonely when he got down there. He didn't take his family with him. And his children took it upon themselves, especially his daughter Bessie, to prevail upon him to write his memoirs while he was in Nicaragua. They'd been trying to get him to do it for a long time, and he'd been too busy making a living, rearing a family, and so forth. But once he was down there, they knew he was bored. Bessie did for sure. She bundled up 2 blank ledger books and mailed them to him and said, in effect, "Papa, I know you're not too busy now. In fact, I know you're wondering what to do. Here are the ledger books. You have a pen or a pencil. Please write down your part of the war for your family." He was reluctant to do so in the beginning, and you can tell early on that his heart really isn't in it, but after a few dozen pages go by, he begins to hit his stride, and very quickly, Alexander was completely immersed in this project. Now, he had at hand as aids a little log or diary that he had kept during the war. He had a small shelf of published books, including the Century War book at hand, and he had correspondence with fellow officers from the war. He also would ask his wife occasionally for some of his wartime letters if he was uncertain about a point. One good thing, as he wrote, he never guessed at something. If he didn't know something, he'd leave a blank spot in the manuscript and make a note to look that up later. So he didn't do what almost all other memoirists do, which is just make it exactly the way they want it, whether they really remember or not. You, of course, should always be careful about how you use memoirs and reminiscences, just as you should be careful about how you use modern-day oral histories. I'll bet there's not a person under this tent who could tell me exactly what you did on June 3rd, 3 years ago, unless it's a date that stands out for some special reason in your mind. You should always be leery of someone who pretends they can remember everything without anything near at hand to help them. Alexander had a number of things at hand. He also had a quite remarkable memory. But down in Greytown, Nicaragua, chapter after chapter poured out. When I'm writing in those times, he wrote to his wife, during this period, I hardly know where to stop. Now, he had no intention of publishing these memoirs, which is wonderful for us now that they've been published, because it gave him a freedom to say exactly what he thought. He didn't pull any punches in this reminiscence. This was going to be his legacy to his family, and he wanted it to be as frank and full and honest a portrayal of his war as possible. He was able, therefore, to make observations in fighting for the Confederacy that, if you line them up, include wonderful anecdotes, brutally frank appraisals of federal officers and politicians on both sides in the war, as well as brilliant insights into campaigns and battles, strategic, tactical support. It's really a remarkable book, again, partly because he had no thought of publication. Almost all Civil War memoirs or reminiscences are filled with special pleading, many of them written with an agenda to get even with comrades. Hood's and Joe Johnston's books are written at each other. There's usually an agenda, and it's usually not hidden. It's obvious in them what they're up to. Porter Alexander wrote, because he wrote just for his family, he wrote without that kind of an agenda. By 1901, he decided to publish a more formal account of the war. People had told him he should, and so what he did was take Fighting for the Confederacy. He cut out about a quarter of the material, much of the personal material. He toned down many of his harsher observations, and he ended up with military memoirs. If you put the two books side by side, about two-thirds of Fighting for the Confederacy appears in roughly the same form in military memoirs of a Confederate. But the one-third that Alexander cut was almost all either personal material, including a long section on his pre-war life, or passages in which Alexander had leveled very strong criticisms against various individuals, including Stonewall Jackson and R.E. Lee. In short, the material that didn't find its way into military memoirs is precisely the kind of unvarnished testimony that's almost impossible to find in Civil War reminiscences. Bob Crick and I talked about this manuscript many years ago. Bob had gotten clues that it existed, that it was different from military memoirs. He and I argued about which one of us should edit it. In the end, Bob persuaded me to do it. He's regretted that ever since, but he did persuade me to do it. I think he didn't do it because Alexander served in James Longstreet's Corps, and Bob didn't want to spend the time he'd have to spend with the First Corps. He's a committed Stonewall Jackson file, if that's a word. If there's a Stonewall Jackson cult, Bob's part of it. He talks about Longstreet cults, and I think there is one. Well, there's a Jackson cult as well, and Bob is certainly in the front row of that. At any rate, Bob didn't do it. I'm delighted that he didn't do it, because it was an absolutely delightful experience to work on Porter Alexander's unpublished reminiscences. As I said earlier, I think, and this isn't because of anything I did to it as editor, on the merits, I think this is the best set of reminiscences by any soldier on either side during the war. It's franker, it's more revealing, and I think it reads better than almost any other one. He has a very conversational style, and it's simply a gripping set of reminiscences. I think it's much more honest, much more even-handed, for example, than Grant's, which have a reputation for being very even-handed. They aren't, of course. They're filled with special pleading and getting even with other people, but they have that reputation. All right, let me finish now this afternoon by quoting a few passages from Fighting for the Confederacy that'll give you some of its flavor, whet your appetite, so to speak. And I'm going to give you a warning in advance here that among the things that Alexander did that virtually no one else did was he quoted profanity, verbatim, from people in different situations during the war. So there's going to be some profanity in this presentation. Every bit of it is Porter Alexander's, so if you want to get upset, write a letter, and I don't know what you'll do with it because it won't hurt Porter Alexander, but you can write it if it makes you feel better and do something. But this is, in a couple of places, Porter Alexander upset about things or quoting people who are upset about things. Let me start with a vignette from First Manassas. The reminiscence is studded with memorable scenes from many battlefields. One of these occurred at First Manassas, where Joe Johnston was crossing a piece of the field after the Federal rout had begun, and the civilian spectators who'd ridden out to watch the great victory and the Union Army all mixed up and withdrawing rather rapidly toward the east. Alexander was riding along, and he reached at one point the rear of the 8th South Carolina Regiment. It was commanded by a former fire eater named Ellerby B.C. Cash, and I'll quote Alexander now. Said, "I saw a very fine-looking sergeant major come out of the woods on the left with a small man in citizen's dress and take him before the colonel, Colonel Cash, at the head of the regiment. The colonel was a tall, stalwart fellow, apparently 35 or 40 years old, red-headed, red-faced, light gray-eyed, and strong-featured. As I approached him that afternoon, his face was as angry-looking as a storm cloud, and he'd drawn his revolver and was trying to shoot the little citizen, who was dodging behind the big sergeant major, as Cash turned his horse about and tried to get at him, poking at him with the pistol and swearing with a fluency which would have been creditable to a wagon master. 'You infernal son of a bitch, you came to see the fun, didn't you? God damn your dirty soul, I'll show you.' And he spurred his horse to get around the sergeant major. 'What's the matter, Colonel?' said I. 'What are you trying to shoot that man for?' 'He's a member of Congress, God damn him,' said the colonel. 'Came out here to see the fun, came out to see us whipped and killed. God damn him, if it wasn't for such as he, there would be no war. They've made it and then come to gloat over it. God damn him, I'll show him.' And again Cash tried to get at the poor little fellow, who was evidently scared almost into a fit. 'But, Colonel,' I said, 'you mustn't shoot a prisoner, never shoot an unarmed man.' I spoke authoritatively, for Beauregard had published an order that all officers of his staff spoke with his authority. And Cash recognized it and made no kick. 'Turn him over to the provost guard,' he said to the sergeant major, 'and then go and hunt the woods for Senator Foster. He's hiding in there somewhere. Go and find him. And God damn you, if you bring him in alive, I'll cut your ears off.'" Well, at that point, this little civilian that Alexander was describing, who was Congressman Alfred Ely of New York, was on his way to the rear area of the Confederate Army and eventually to Richmond, where he would have a stay in a Confederate prison. He never went, incidentally, Ely never went to watch another battle after this. Once he got home, he'd paid a very high price for going out, as Cash said, to see the fun. There are a lot of vignettes in the book that show how the war capriciously worked its effects on civilians who were simply caught in the path of the war, and not just when battles were fought. This incident came toward the end of 1861 while the Army was encamped near Centerville. Alexander watched the Washington artillery one day out at practice. He liked to hang around with the gunners. He'd talk to them, watch them talk about different elements of their craft, and he was watching them have target practice this day. Before they started to fire, they'd sent someone out to check the area at which they were going to be shooting to make sure there were no civilians there, and then they fired a number of rounds of different kinds, solid shot and spherical case and shell, as Alexander said, over a large wood in a valley below, at a tree in a clearing beyond the wood. After the shooting, wrote Alexander, I rode with officers to look about the target. When at the far edge of the wood, just in our line of fire, we saw a house. It seemed deserted, which we thought was fortunate, as the officers sent out to examine had failed to see it and had reported that all was clear. But when we rode up, there were clothes hanging on a line, and we saw that a cannon shot had gone through the upper story, and the side of the house was all peppered with case-shot bullets. We dismounted, and opening the door and calling, out came a poor woman, evidently in a very delicate condition of health, and 3 children, all nearly scared to death. A 4th child had run off somewhere in the woods, but it was soon found all right. The mother, when the shells began to fly, had gotten the 3 children and taken refuge under the bed upstairs. And while they were under the bed, a solid shot passed through, tearing the mattress open. Most fortunately, no one was hurt, but I believe the poor woman had a severe illness and premature delivery of an infant brought on by the terror and the shock. In other parts of the manuscript, Alexander has other memorable passages about civilians caught in the capricious path of the war. Alexander prided himself on his realism, and he had scant patience with anyone who thought that anything but hard work and good leadership and hard fighting would win the war. This is an excerpt representative of a sub-theme that runs throughout the reminiscences. It's customary to say that Providence did not intend that we should win, he wrote, but I don't subscribe in the least to that doctrine. Providence didn't care a row of pins about it. That row of pins is one of his expressions. If it did, it was a very unintelligent Providence, not to bring the business to a close, the close it wanted, in less than 4 years of the most terrible and bloody war. And while on the subject, I'll say that I think it was a serious incubus upon us that during the whole war, our president and many of our generals really and actually, he underlined both of those, believed that there was this mysterious providence, always hovering over the field and ready to interfere on one side or the others, and that prayers and piety might win its favor from day to day. It was a weakness, concluded Alexander, to imagine that victory would ever come in even the slightest degree from anything except our own exertions. Alexander reserved some of his harshest criticisms for Stonewall Jackson's performance during the 7 days. He also believed that Jackson suffered particularly from a misplaced reliance on Providence. He thought Lee's plans during the 7 days were ruined by what he called, quote, the incredible slackness and delay and hanging back which characterized General Jackson's performance of his part of the work. But little has been said about it in the press. As compared with Longstreet's alleged shortcomings at Gettysburg, nothing at all. And I'll say parenthetically that Alexander thought Longstreet hadn't done especially well at Gettysburg. I don't think the excuse that Jackson's inaction was due to physical exhaustion will at all bear analysis. For 3 successive nights and 2 entire days after the Battle of Gaines's Mill, Jackson had been in camp near that battlefield. He had especially done nothing all day Sunday. June 29th, the Battle of Savage Station took place that day, although every hour then was precious. My own solution of the matter is that he thought God could and would easily make up for any little shortcomings of his own and give us the victory anyway. Many times in the manuscript, Alexander returns to Jackson at the 7 days. You can tell that even many years after the fact, he was still distressed at what he considered a very poor performance by Stonewall Jackson during the 7 days. One of the best parts of this book is its portrayal of Robert E. Lee. It's an absolutely brilliant analytical as well as descriptive portrayal of Lee. I thought for a while about extracting the parts on Lee and publishing them separately because they're so good. They're so filled with insights and they show so many elements of Lee's character that virtually no one else wrote about. From the Confederate side, they show Lee's pettiness on occasion, they show his anger, they show his humor brilliantly. There are a number of very nice vignettes of Lee that show his sense of humor. He lost his temper with Alexander a couple of times, and one of those times came in October 1864. Lee at that time was hoping to dislodge the Federals from Fort Harrison, north of the James. The siege of Richmond and Petersburg, of course, was well underway by then. On the afternoon of October 6, he ordered Alexander to move 2 battalions of artillery to the Darbytown Road to support an assault that Lee wanted to launch on the 7th of October. Lee told Alexander that he wanted him to move at 2 a.m. At 1:30 a.m., Alexander was just finishing breakfast when Colonel Charles Venable of Lee's staff rode up. "Alec," he said, I'm quoting Alexander here, "Alec," he said, "come on, the old man is out here waiting for you and mad enough to bite nails." "Why?" I said. "It's only 1:30, and he told me he would start at 2. "Yes," said Venable, 2 o'clock was the hour he told us all last night, but now he swears he said 1. And he scolded everybody and started off alone, and with scarcely any breakfast, because nothing was ready. Presently, Alexander and Venable ride over to Lee, who was sitting on Traveler beside the road. "I remember the conversation very vividly," continued Alexander. "Good morning, General Alexander. I had hoped to find you waiting in the road for me on my arrival. This was said with the very utmost stiffness and formality. Yes, sir. I was ready and might have been here just as well, but you told me last night that you'd start at 2 o'clock, and it's not near that yet, so I didn't hurry, which I said as good-naturedly and blandly as I knew how. 1 o'clock was the hour, sir, at which I said I would start. This was said with a very severe emphasis. I misunderstood then, General. I thought you said 2. 1 o'clock, sir, was the hour. This was said so emphatically that I concluded to let General Lee have the last word. And I said no more. Very generous of Alexander there to let him have the last word. Lee wasn't finished with him yet. He then asked Alexander if he'd gotten a guide to lead them to the point of attack. Alexander hadn't been told to do so. He expected a member of Lee's staff to arrange for a guide. So I said, no, General. As the subject was not mentioned, I suppose no guide would be needed. And I would only have to follow you. And then we get a passage from Lee that I suspect will resonate with some of the males in this audience. Well, sir, when I was a young man, said Lee, and had a march to make in the morning, I never went to bed until I had procured some citizen of the neighborhood who could conduct me. Well, we'll have to make the best of it. Colonel Venable, will you ride ahead and guide us then? Now, unluckily for poor Venable, he was conversing with one of the staff and didn't hear his name called. General Lee paused for a moment, then called to one of his couriers. I'll have to ask you to act upon my staff today, for my officers are all disappointing me. Meanwhile, someone had told Venable that the general had called him, and he spurred forward just in time to hear it all and to be sent back while the courier took the lead. Poor Venable. He was deeply mortified, but for my part, I didn't mind it a row of pins, which I doubt, for I knew that I'd not deserved it, and it was only that something had upset the remarkable control of his temper which the general usually preserved. Before the morning was over, he became particularly and especially gracious and good-natured to me, and to everyone else around him, except poor Venable. Venable told me afterward that for 2 weeks the general never addressed him except officially. Now, I submit that that's a side of Lee that you don't see very many places. Lee in a snit, Lee punishing Venable for something that was Lee's fault. The largest section of Alexander's book is devoted to Gettysburg, about 100 pages of it, and much of what we know about different aspects of Gettysburg comes from Alexander, from what he published in Battles and Leaders, from what he published elsewhere, Southern Historical Society papers, and what he published in military memoirs and here. Now, his account in fighting for the Confederacy follows in general outline his other accounts, but it has more detail and it adds nuances to what we know about especially the bombardment and the interaction with James Longstreet on July 3rd that we can't get from any other account. There's much of the back and forth between Longstreet and Porter Alexander, and between Porter Alexander and George E. Pickett just before the brigades of Pickett and Pettigrew and Trimble stepped off on that terrible passage from Seminary Ridge to Cemetery Ridge. As I said, it's similar, but different in significant ways. Now, the setup is that Alexander's in charge of the bombardment. In fact, Longstreet has tried to put the whole onus of whether or not there'll be an assault on the shoulders of this colonel of artillery rather than exercising his core responsibilities as he should have been. Alexander had set aside some howitzers that he would use to follow up the Confederate infantry, help support and exploit the break if there was one, and he's just found out that these guns have disappeared. It's Parson Pendleton is at his worst together with another officer. Alexander had been told to watch and see if the Union fire slackened from the area of the angle and then announce when the time to go in would be. This is where his account picks up. When General Longstreet came, I told him how the enemy had withdrawn their guns and we would certainly get a favorable start. But I expressed impatience at Pickett's delay, and I told him of the howitzers being taken off. I said I feared the support I could give might not be all I wished and had counted upon. General Longstreet spoke at once and decidedly. Go and halt General Pickett right now where he is and replenish your ammunition. I said, General, we can't do that. We nearly emptied our ammunition trains last night. Even if we had it, it would take an hour or two, and meanwhile the enemy would recover from the pressure he's now under. Our only chance is to follow it up now, to strike while the iron is hot. Longstreet answered, I don't want to make this attack. I believe it will fail. I do not see how it can succeed. I would not make it even now, but that General Lee has ordered and expects it. He made these statements with slight pauses in between while he was looking at the enemy's position through his field glasses. I had the feeling that he was upon the verge of stopping the charge, and that with even slight encouragement, he would do it. But that very feeling kept me from saying a word, either of assent or dissent. I would not willingly take any responsibility in so grave a matter, and I had almost a morbid fear of personally causing any loss of time. So I stood by and looked on in silence, almost embarrassing. After sending my last hurry-up notes to Pickett at 1:35 p.m., I don't recall looking at my watch again that day. So I cannot be absolutely sure, but I think it was not earlier than 1:50, nor later than 2 p.m., when with great relief and delight, I saw Pickett's line approaching at a good fast gait. Now, one interesting aspect of Alexander's description of the bombardment that preceded the Pickett-Pettigrew assault is that it didn't last even an hour. Most accounts say that it lasted 2 hours, that it went from 1 o'clock until 3 o'clock. Alexander devotes a good deal of attention to that and suggests very strongly there wasn't enough ammunition for a 2-hour bombardment. He says that he thinks it lasted half an hour to 45 minutes. A few years ago, I acquired a set of the books New York at Gettysburg that belonged to Porter Alexander. They had been given to him by Dan Sickles, inscribed to him by Dan Sickles, and Alexander had gone through in the margins and annotated this New York at Gettysburg set. And at one place, it said that the Confederate bombardment lasted 2 hours. Alexander had crossed through that and written 30 minutes out in the side. So this is an interesting instance of what you do with historical evidence and how you reconcile different pieces of evidence. It's very hard to do so. Let me finish with one more little piece from Alexander. This is, I think, one of the more moving descriptions of the Confederate retreat from Richmond. Alexander is getting ready to leave the city after the Confederates have retreated, and he looks back, turns around from the Manchester high grounds across the James to look back at the river and at the city. He says, "It was after sunrise of a bright morning when from the Manchester high grounds we turned to take our last look at the old city for which we had fought so long and so hard. It was a sad, a terrible, and a solemn sight. I don't know that any moment in the whole war impressed me more deeply with all of its stern realities than this. The whole riverfront seemed to be in flames amid which occasional heavy explosions were heard, and the black smoke spreading and hanging over the city seemed to be full of dreadful portents. I rode on with a distinctly heavy heart and with a peculiar sort of feeling of orphanage." I think that anyone who follows Porter Alexander's story through all of the Civil War will come away with a number of things. You'll come away with insights into various actions and personalities that you didn't have before. You'll also come away with a store of evocative passages such as this one about the fall of Richmond. I think that fighting for the Confederacy and Porter Alexander will amply repay the good deal of time it takes to slog through the 600-plus pages of his reminiscence. Thank you. Couple of questions, Craig says. Couple of questions. Yes.
Can you comment on the accuracy of that bombardment on the third day? We've heard so much that he overshot his target. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes. Well, I comment on the accuracy of the Confederate bombardment. Well, it wasn't very accurate, as I think most of us know. Alexander says in his reminiscences he was under no illusion that it would be. The Confederate ordnance during the war was remarkably unreliable. At Chancellorsville, just 2 months before Gettysburg, one of the artillerists said that only 1 shell in 16 that his battery fired even exploded. So the Confederates could not rely on their ammunition. Joe Glatar, one of our best Civil War historians, is working on a history of the Army in Northern Virginia, and he found some records, some ordnance records from South Carolina from the place that sent ammunition to Lee's army before Gettysburg, and the tests of those rounds indicate that they were exploding late. And that may very well be what was going on. Much of the overshooting that took place here may have been with those rounds that the tests in South Carolina indicated the fuses were not working correctly, and they were exploding late, and therefore the rounds weren't hitting where they should. But even under the best of circumstances, it would have been very hard for Confederate artillery to hit a target as shallow as the Union line along Cemetery Ridge. Alexander argues in his book When he came back to the battlefield later and saw what the whole Union position looked like, he said the place to attack it would have been the bend in the fishhook, so that the 2nd Corps guns and the 3rd Corps guns could have had a much deeper target. If they overshot, they'd hit something on the other side. Yes?
Hi, what are some other good memoirs or reminiscences that you know of besides this one?
What are some other good memoirs or reminiscences? There's an enormous number of them. Grant's, I think, very good. Some I think, are not very good. Joe Johnston's I would put in that category. Anything that Alfred Pleasanton wrote, I would put in that category, a notorious dissembler. Some much better than other. Longstreet's are good for some things, but not good for many. Jubal Early, although he has a reputation as being highly controversial, actually wrote a very straightforward memoir that is quite reliable on the whole. There are too many to run down. But they're usually passages that tip off whether they're good or not, and you can usually tell if someone has an agenda or not, if they're trying to get even with somebody or not. Grant, for example, almost never mentions George H. Thomas. George H. Thomas is virtually absent from Grant's memoirs. Thomas wasn't part of Grant's inner circle. Phil Sheridan gets his full due. Sherman gets his full due. George H. Thomas gets much less than his full due in Grant. One more? Is that it? One more.
Yes, I'd like to ask you a question. With the new wave of historians reviewing Lee's strategy and tactics during the Civil War, how do you feel, for instance, some people will criticize Robert E. Lee for his costly offensives, which bled his army dry. Do you feel that this was justified with the meager resources that the South had, or do you feel he was pursuing the right strategy?
I don't have time to give you my full speech on that, but in very briefly, I think this notion that Lee didn't understand the best way for the Confederates to fight the war, that he was far too aggressive, that he piled up casualties too quickly, I think that is just exactly 100% wrong. It's become a sort of cottage industry to make that argument. Building on J.F.C. Fuller and Tom Conley and Alan Nolan, there's been a gaggle of books over the last couple of years which add absolutely nothing new in either sources or argument to what we already know. What they leave out of their equation is the impact of Lee's campaigns on the respective home fronts. That's the key. Counting casualties doesn't get you to the essence of the question. The impact of the operations gets you to the essence of the question, and if you look at Lee's campaigns through that lens, the conclusion is inescapable that he fought the war in the manner best calculated to win Confederate independence. Don't be beguiled by knowing what happened at Appomattox and reading backward to understand the war. You will go wrong every time, not just during the Civil War, but in any historical question. Don't take to your attempt to understand it everything we know now. We're awfully smart now. We know how it turned out. Read forward in the sources if you want to get a good sense if people acted reasonably, if what they did made sense. Read the reactions at the time to Lee's operations. Don't read what people wrote after the war, and do not begin at Appomattox and read backward to try to understand why the war went the way it did. I'll talk more about that if I ever get another chance. Thank you.
Gary Gallagher teaches history at the University of Virginia. Fighting for the Confederacy is published by the University of North Carolina Press. Mr. Gallagher is also the author of a book called The Confederate War.
Confederate Army gathering near Manassas Junction, and as Chief of Ordnance. Most of his time was actually spent in the area of ordnance. That was a bigger job. He got along very well with Beauregard. He then got along very well with Joseph E. Johnston, onto whose staff he went when Beauregard headed west after First Manassas. He wore both those hats under Joe Johnston, the signal officer hat and the Chief of Ordnance hat, and he continued to do that after Johnston was wounded at Seven Pines on May 31st, 1862, and R.E. Lee took command of the army that he would christen the Army of Northern Virginia. Through the 7 days, Second Manassas or Bull Run, through the 1862 Maryland campaign, Alexander was a member of Lee's staff. And he had ample opportunity to observe Lee and also to be observed by Lee in the course of those campaigns. And Lee formed a very high opinion of this young Georgian. Alexander was always interested in artillery. And even when he was an ordnance officer, he thought about artillery. He wrote a paper in 1861 that urged that the Confederate Army organize its guns into battalions of artillery. He thought that would be a more efficient way to apply the strength of the long arm on the battlefield. It was a brilliant paper that caught the attention. Thank you, Craig. I'll make one small correction to what Craig said, and that is that this isn't my most recent book. This is actually a fairly distant book in my past, but one that I enjoyed working on a great deal, maybe enjoyed working on more than any other book that I've had anything to do with. Eileen Ann and I worked on it for about 3.5 years and really hated to finish our work on Porter Alexander because he was such an interesting fellow and because what he wrote tells us so much about the war here in Virginia. Alexander, who was never Edward to anyone, he was Porter or Alec to his closest friends, is a name familiar to students of R.E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was a remarkable character. I'll just give you the bare outline of his career before moving on to talking about his memoir. He was born into a prominent Georgia family in 1835, graduated from West Point third in the class of 1857 and was appointed a second lieutenant in the engineers. He was considered very promising from the beginning. He was put on the faculty at West Point, where he taught from 1857 to 59, taught military engineering and other topics. He was one of 2 officers selected in 1859 to test the system of vision.
Tonight when William Frasnito's here. Dr. Gallagher is the John L. Now Professor of History of the American Civil War at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. He received his doctorate at the University of Texas in Austin in 1982. In his illustrious career, he has received the Fletcher Pratt Award and the Douglas South Freeman Award, among many, many others. Currently, he is working on the biography of Confederate General Jubal Early and a study of the ways in which Early and Douglas South Freeman influenced modern perceptions about the Confederacy. Today, Dr. Gallagher's speech will discuss his most recent book, Fighting for the Confederacy, the story of the Confederate artillery commander E.P. Alexander, who indeed was present here at Gettysburg. Also present here at Gettysburg, Dr. Gary Gallagher. Please welcome him.
Visual signals developed and offered to the Army by Surgeon Albert J. Meyer, the famous wigwag system that most of us are familiar with. In 1860, Meyer and Alexander recommended that the Army adopt this system, and they went up to Congress to testify on the system. They testified before Senator Jefferson Davis's Committee on Military Affairs and called for the adoption of the system. Davis remembered, he was impressed by Alexander from these hearings that he held, and he remembered the young officer when he, Davis, occupied the presidency of the Confederacy and was looking for young soldiers in early 1861. Alexander was on duty in the Washington Territory when war clouds gathered in late 1860 and early 1861, and he decided very early on that he would do whatever his native state did. If Georgia stayed in the Union, he'd stay in the Union. If Georgia left, he would leave. Georgia left, of course, and Alexander headed back east. He arrived in Richmond June 1st, 1861, and he was commissioned a captain of engineers. His first duty was to oversee the production of signal apparatus in Richmond, and shortly thereafter was sent to Manassas for duty as a signal officer under General P.G.T. Beauregard. He simultaneously served as chief signal officer for that Confederate.
Next, Civil War Sunday continues with historian Gary Gallagher. He discusses the memoirs of Confederate General Edward Porter Alexander, who fought in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. Mr. Gallagher spoke at Greystone's American History Store in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, as part of Greystone's History Books 2000 weekend.
Good evening. We're going to get started with our next speaker. Once again, I am Craig Hafner, president of Greystone Communications, and we welcome you to History Books 2000, put on by the American History Store here in Gettysburg. Next up is Gary Gallagher. He is perhaps the most prolific author of books on Gettysburg and the Civil War, and a frequent participant in many Greystone projects, including Civil War Journal, as seen on A&E and the History Channel, and our newest series, The Unknown Civil War, with 25 hours completed, and episode 26 coming, and we'll hear more about that.